It's time to don that chainmail, because today we're jumping into that age-old battle of which is better, horsepower or torque. Stick around and find out which one is the victor at the end. I'm Rachel DeBarros, and this is Gearhead Diva. So whether you like to wrench on the weekends with your buddies and some beers, or maybe you're that serious engine builder, well, in pretty much every gearhead's garage, you've always had this underlying rivalry of which is better. Should you tune for torque or for horsepower, as if they're two completely separate concepts. And you've probably watched a bunch of videos on this where they spit out a whole bunch of formulas and numbers to try and prove their point. Well, we're going to touch on some formulas and numbers, and as much as I love math, we're going to keep this video the non-Stephen Hawking version of our explanation between torque and horsepower. What really solidifies the concept for me is looking at real-world examples where you put these formulas to use with your own engine in your own performance situation. So that way you know what you need to do to your engine, so that way you get maximum performance for the way that you drive your car. So let's take a look at just the fundamentals to get started. So let's start with torque. So what is torque? Well, it's the twisting or that rotational force around a center axis. So probably the easiest example to think about is if you have a bolt right here and you're trying to tighten it down with your wrench, and you're putting force down against this wrench to either tighten or untighten that bolt. So all torque is the amount of force that you're applying. So to keep it simple, let's say I'm applying 10 pounds of force against this wrench to try and tighten this bolt, and this wrench is 1 foot in length here, just to keep the number simple. So I would be applying 10 pound-feet of torque, and that's what torque is measured in. It's measured in pound-feet. Now I know what some of you are saying. Well, my buddy, when he talks about his engine, he says that it puts out 350 foot-pounds of torque, not pound-feet. What is this pound-feet business? Well, it turns out that the foot-pound versus pound-feet debate actually comes from another really highly related concept called work. And work and torque are very similar, but there is a very important difference between that. And work is measured in foot-pounds, whereas torque is measured in pound-feet. And I'll show you why. And rather than spit out another formula at you, let me just show you. So basically all work is the distance an object moves multiplied by the force applied to move it that distance. So for instance, I have my Hummer here, and let's say that I put 100 pounds of force to try and move it forward. And let's say I'm successful. I move it 1 whole foot, Hercules. That means that I will have done 100 foot-pounds of work. Probably one of the easiest differences that you see here is that work involves a linear motion. The car will move linearly, forward or back, depending on how you're pushing it. And torque is very different because there's no forward or backwards movement. If you think about it, that crankshaft is just spinning in your engine, and that's the main difference between work and torque. So now that we cleared that up, let's get back into our torque discussion. So work and torque tell us how much was done, but it kind of leaves something pretty important out of consideration, which is, well, how fast was it done? I mean, did it take me all day to push my car just 1 foot, or did I do it in just 10 seconds? Well, that's where horsepower comes into play. It addresses this speed or rate issue. Because if it only took me 10 seconds to do the same amount of work that it takes maybe someone else all day long, well, that means that I'd be more powerful. And this whole concept of horsepower actually came about by an 18th century engineer by the name of James Watt. So some of you outside the US are pretty familiar with watt, kilowatt. So he was just observing these horses working the mines, and their job was to help hoist and pull these baskets of minerals out from underneath the mine and all the way up where they were then collected. So by observing all these horses, he kind of came up with the concept that, you know what, 1 horsepower is the amount of power that it takes to perform 33,000 foot-pounds of work in 1 minute. So you may be asking, well, what does James Watt's Pony in the Mines formula for horsepower have anything to do with today's modern engines? I mean, they're kind of different. Well, if you take that formula and you combine it with the concept of torque, you can actually mathematically drill it down to today's popular horsepower formula that all the dynos use. And that's horsepower equals the amount of torque multiplied by an engine's RPM divided by 5252. Now, if you're a math nut, and I totally did this, I admit, you can Google this mathematical drill down process. I went ahead and included it in the description so you can see how one formula turns into this other formula here. But for the purposes of this video, we're basically just going to jump forward in time and look at this more popular formula, which is the horsepower equals torque multiplied by an engine's RPM divided by 5252. Now, without doing any math whatsoever, a couple key relationships should already start jumping out at you. And the first one is that you can obviously see that, well, torque is not totally separate from horsepower. Horsepower actually needs torque. It's a component of what gives you your horsepower, along with engine RPM. So you can see how engines produce power in different ways. Some of them give you greater torque. Others are higher revving to contribute to that number. And not only that, when you take your car to be dynoed, either at the engine or the chassis, it turns out the dyno is not even really measuring horsepower. That's like a man-made number. It's measuring the torque and the RPMs of your engine, and then using this very same formula to convert and give you your horsepower, and then give you your horsepower curve. So that's how it figures out horsepower. And the other thing that you're going to notice is that 5252 number at the bottom. Like, what the heck is that? Where does that come from? Well, that comes from that mathematical drill down that you can see in the description. But also, if you look at any dyno chart, once you follow along that RPM line, and that RPM line gets to 5252, well, we all know a number divided by itself cancels itself out. So this is the part of the dyno chart where you're going to see your torque and your horsepower intersect. So your horsepower will be equal to your torque every time at 5252. Now that we know that torque and RPM are the two key players in the game here, that's going to give us the horsepower we want, it kind of reminds me of two engine scenarios, like the big displacement, lower revving engine like you see in muscle cars and drag racing, versus the smaller displacement but really high revving engines that you see with Formula One race cars. So let's start by looking at the torque component. So what can we do to get more torque? The first thing I think of when trying to get more torque is just improving the airflow into the engine, trying to cram more air into that engine. And there's a couple of things you can do, like aftermarket cold air intake, a better exhaust so that way the air can evacuate that much faster. Valves also play a role, like how big they are, how many you have, the lift, the duration, all that controls how much air is coming into the engine. But at the end of the day, after you do all those mods, you're gonna kind of come to the conclusion that torque is very closely tied to cylinder filling. You can only get so much air into those cylinders, and therefore displacement of your engine. So I have my 318, which I pulled out of my CUDA, and as much as I love that 318, and don't knock it, with the right mods that can make 400 horsepower, you all, so I might play around with that. But at the end of the day, if my goal for that engine is to make 500 pound-feet of torque, well, it ain't gonna happen. I'm gonna have to go with a much larger engine, because you know what they say, there's no replacement for displacement. So even though your torque is pretty limited by your engine's original displacement, I mean, you can always go the artificial displacement route and bolt on a supercharger or a turbo, but at the end of the day, you can still move where that peak torque happens along the power curve to suit your motorsports need. And I'm talking about the whole small bore long stroke versus big bore short stroke debate. So far, we've only talked about torque at the engine, but what about torque at the wheels? And that's kind of a whole separate video when you get into transmission and gearing, because gears are torque multipliers, but I just wanted to mention it here because it does affect torque. And so you have your low gears that have, of course, high gear numbers to accelerate from a dead stop. That's what gives you your torque, but a low top speed. And then you have your high gears, meaning they have low gear numbers, and that's what gives you your top speed, but of course at the expense of torque. So that's an entirely different conversation we can have, dedicate a whole other video to gearing and maximizing that gearing for the way that you drive. But moving along now, we spent a lot of time on torque, which is a big part of the horsepower equation, but what about its other half, which is the RPM? When I think about big RPM numbers, the first thing that comes to mind are those smaller, low displacement Formula One race car motors, because although they're small and don't produce much torque, they still produce huge horsepower numbers. I'm talking like at least 800 horsepower, and they do it because they rev really high, and I'm talking 18,000 or 20,000 RPM. And the way they're able to do that is by using lightweight components, of course high performance components, pistons, crankshaft, valves, also improved cooling, improved oil, and also a larger bore stroke combination. So that allows them to keep their top speed. Not only that, but their 7-speed close ratio gearboxes are really made not so much for acceleration, but they keep them in those narrow bands of top speed. Because if you think about it, unlike drag racing where you have to accelerate pretty much most of the time a heavy car from a dead stop where you need that torque and that acceleration, these cars are much lighter. So even if you were to throw all that torque on them, most likely their wheels would just spin. So top speed is where it's at for them. And even though they're slowing down to go into a curve, and by slowing down, well, that's kind of a relative term because their slowdown is still faster than a lot of the top speeds that cars need to make for other motorsports. So it doesn't take much acceleration to get them back into the game. So which is better? Should I focus my attention on the torque half of the horsepower equation or on the RPM part of it? Or, you know, why not both? The most important thing you can do is to maximize your engine's output at the RPM where it spends most of its time, where it lives the most. And that's going to be different if your car is more of a street driver or daily driver, if you drag race, or if you spend more time doing more high-speed continuous racing where top speed is really important. So I'd love to hear what range of the spectrum you guys all fall in. Do you like torque monsters or high revving screamers? Let me know, post in the comments. And next time we're going to take a deeper dive into dyno charts, find out specifically what mods produce what changes along the power curve. So until next time, I got some wrenching to do on that 318. 400 is the goal. See you guys.